So we're setting up the quarter barrel brewing Umsel apparatus today for brewing beer. We have a 3-kettle operation, and I'm filling the hot liquor tank with water. But this is really just to clean the system to start. We're set up with 220 volts control for the hot liquor tank, the mash tun, and the brew kettle. And Howard and I have just plugged everything in, and we're giving it the dry test just to make sure nothing leaks. It's important to have a bucket present when that happens because something will invariably leak. So we'll give it a test with just water, and then in about half an hour we'll set it up for the real thing, assuming we have no leak. And that's what we'll do. We'll fill in all the aspects. So we'll have the salt combinations, the grain bill, everything we need. I have prepared here a yeast starter for today's batch quarter barrel brew, and I started that the other night with a dried malt extract, which I now have a little bit on the table so you can see how dried and powdery it is. Oh my goodness. And it makes a mess. Once you add water to it, it turns to something like molasses. But nonetheless, we would have started with a liquid yeast. I used a Y yeast packet, and I would have started that yesterday by slapping the packet to release the yeast into the nutrients that are in here, shake it up, let it sit for a few hours. It expands very nicely, blows up like a little balloon. And once that happens, I can then take that yeast and I can build up more yeast cells by using a yeast starter. So I might have, in this they say 100 billion yeast cells. I can probably double that to 200 billion by using a yeast starter. That's particularly useful because we're brewing on quarter barrel scale, so we need a little bit more yeast. So we'll do that by using the malt extract and making a malt directly. That's just like powdered milk. You had it, heat it up to a boil, and you have a nice malt instantly. So this stuff is great for doing that sort of activity. Once that's done and I've cooled it down in a sanitized container, I can add the liquid yeast, and I'll stir that overnight. And by stirring it, it allows it to pick up oxygen from the air and feed the yeast cells so they can propagate. And so hopefully we've now built up to about 200 million yeast cells. This will go into our brew after we cool down the wort. We can then add the yeast directly and allow it to ferment. Well, we're just about ready to start the mashing. We have the hot liquor tank heated up. It's to 160 degrees now. I'm going to put it in on automatic. That's about where I want it. 160 to 170. There'll be a little loss in heat when I move it to the mash tun. I want the mash tun to be 160. We'll see what we get. We got to warm it up a little bit. We've already prepared some salts for us. So Stefan and Carl have put together some salts for us, and we've added at least the calcium chloride directly to the water tank. So we have 9 gallons of water with added calcium chloride. We add salts to get the chloride content, the calcium content, the carbonate content, and the water hardness, where we want it to be for this particular brew. St. Louis water is wonderful, but adding a little chloride and carbonate can help us reproduce the kinds of conditions we would have had for European ales. That's what we're after today. So we've got that ready to go. We've just ground up the grain, so we have everything from our grain bill is in here, which is mostly ground 2-row barley, although we have a little bit of wheat adjunct added and a little bit of a Crystal 60 or 80, I forget which one we used, but we used a toasted, was it 80? 60. Crystal 80 that we added to it, a little toasted grain to give us that profile as well. And we also have the hops that we're going to use today for the brew, and they're laid out here. So we're going to add 3 hops additions. We'll have some Cascade that we add at the very beginning, and we'll follow that up with some aroma and flavor hops that we've added at the end. Primarily using materials that were left over from a previous semester. We're preparing materials for the class this semester. This will allow us to have plenty of beer for analysis, whatever that may be. So we've got
Ron, you got that over there?
So we've got that.
Yeah, I got it.
In fact, I'm going to go ahead and just turn that on a little bit.
Number 1, I have number 2 there. I have the weights.
Run it around a little bit.
Or when you put in number 2?
I do it down. We're about 61. That looks good to me.
Carl,
okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do this. Why don't you take the paddle, Carl, and just make sure it's doing in properly.
Yeah, of course.
And we'll get her going.
Yeah. Get her on in there. Looking
So
good.
Now go ahead and sweep that around a little bit. Smells good. And I'll put the top on as soon as you figure you got that mixed in a little bit.
Yeah, push this. I still got a little bit more work to do, I think.
All right. We're at the point now where we're transferring everything from the mash tun into the boiling kettle. And so we've been mashing for about an hour actually, and a little longer because we had a plumbing problem, but that's fixed and resolved. So at this point we're transferring what is now wort, because it's been mashed with the grains, into the boil kettle. So we got the boil kettle here, it's about half full at least. And now we're sparging the grains by adding fresh water, 160 degrees Fahrenheit, and running that over the grain bed to extract the last of the sugars out of the grain itself and put them into the boil kettle. So in a few minutes we'll have everything transferred in the boil kettle. We can get an initial boil gravity, and we can start adding, we can start heating it up to a boil and adding our hops.